Very nice. So good afternoon to everyone from Sarasota, Florida. That's what the time zone I'm in. My name is Grace KEENAN, and I'm the current student body president and trustee of the New College of Florida. And it's an honor to be introducing today's discussion put on by Alt Liberal Arts. For those who don't know, Alt Liberal Arts is a nonprofit education initiative offering alternative and online learning platforms to fill the gaps created by bans, censors, and threats that result in self-censorship in colleges and early college studies in the U.S. This is academics concerned about academia. It supports students and faculty in the interest of promoting academic freedom and free inquiry. Alt Liberal Arts believes that if a democracy does not have freedom of education, it cannot preserve freedom in any part of society. Now more than ever, it is time to support open inquiry and civic engagement for students and scholars, and that is what we are doing today. Before I introduce today's panelists, I'm going to put you onto a few events that are happening in November. First, I wanted to mention Jonathan Friedman's lecture series on free expression in education starting on the 7th, then Michael Sadowski on supporting LGBTQ plus youth in the Don't Say Gay or Trans era, starting on the 6th, and then Maya Wiley, the Assault on Critical Race Theory, starting on the 15th. This panel today is going to discuss the role of civic engagement in academic institutions, what that means, the role of institutions play, and how to be civically engaged in environments where we are seeing laws passed that directly or indirectly censor speech in academic institutions, like what we are seeing in Florida, and especially the New College of Florida, which has made national and international news this year for being the target of a political takeover. During the panel, there should be a Q&A section that you'll be able to submit questions to. And now it's an honor to introduce our panelists. First is Jonathan Becker, who serves as the Executive Vice President, Director for the Center of Civic Engagement, and Vice President of Academic Affairs at Bard College. And if that wasn't enough, he also serves as the Vice Chancellor of the Open Society University Network. His expertise is in politics, and more specifically, Russian and Eastern European politics, media and politics, and comparative politics. Second, my fellow Novo, Dr. Margee Ensign. She is currently serving as the president of the American University of Bulgaria, and she has previously served as the president of the American University of Nigeria and the president of Dickinson College. She's an incredibly well-respected scholar on international development, and she completed her undergraduate degree right here at the New College of Florida, where she also served as student council president. With that, I shall pass it over to her. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace, for that kind introduction. Greetings to Jonathan. And Grace, thank you for all the good work that you're doing at our wonderful New College. Some of the work I'm talking about tonight wouldn't have happened without New College. I'm not sure I would have found myself out in Nigeria without someone named Dr. Peggy Bates, who was my advisor there. So what I'd like to share tonight, and if I could share the screen, that would be great. All right. So the question, of course, is what role should higher education institutions play in society? And I believe our mission as universities really has to be aligned with the aspirations of the local and the global societies that we live in, that we serve. So what is the purpose of education? Of course, it's about ensuring that individuals are successful and in their professional life and their personal life. I think this slide is a bit of an evolution of the role of education. All universities know that we have to be doing community service, but is that comprehensive? How is that connected to the classroom? Some universities connect their academic work to funded projects in civic learning and action. I think actually the U.S. land-grant universities are really good models for what we're talking about tonight, because when they were established in the 1800s in the U.S., the goal immediately was to make sure the knowledge and the expertise and the educational resources from universities were delivered instantly to local communities to ensure agricultural production and other things. And now, of course, the trend globally is to align our learning with the SDGs, to align our learning with impact in our societies, whether local or global. And I think that's a really important development. I think all of you on this webinar, I don't even need to say this, but we live in a world of great challenges. I've seen great progress also. Some of our challenges are as old as our species: conflict, food insecurity, war, racism, pandemics. Some are really quite new, as you see on the slide. Of course, climate change being one of the biggest ones. Just 2 weeks ago, the AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, came out with some pretty startling research. The headline, Earth is now well outside the safe operating space for humanity. We have breached 6 of the 9 boundaries. What a wake-up call to humanity. Here's the 9 boundaries. So as educators, I think everyone in this call, I hope, feels the same, that at this critical moment in history, we have a profound responsibility as educators to prepare students with all the capabilities they need, not just knowledge and skills that we always talk about, but really confidence and courage, what they need to thrive in this rapidly changing, complex world, not only to make sure we're contributing as individuals, but as institutions of higher education to ensure we're transforming lives in society into work for the common good. Very briefly, in 10 minutes, 2 brief case studies. What I learned about civic learning and engagement in solving problems and what that does to create leaders in Nigeria and then in the pandemic in the US, and lessons learned that might be helpful. This slide just tells you the world that our students will live in, not the world we live in. Demography is a driver of social change and challenges, right? So even 2 years ago, the projections were that it would take till 2050 for India to be the top country. Last year, India became the top country in the world in terms of population, followed by China. Nigeria is number 3. There are 3 countries in Africa that will be the biggest in population in the next 20 or so or less years. I found it amusing last week that the New York Times discovered that the future of the youthful world is in that big continent. So Nigeria is facing all sorts of challenges, not only rapid population growth, doubling every 28 to 31 years, huge problems with poverty, with health indicators, and also with terrorism and conflict. So the American University of Nigeria is in Yola, in northeast Nigeria. You can see what it borders. And a group called Boko Haram began just up here, not that far, a few hours from the university. So when I first became president, students were doing really interesting and important community service, working with students in the community, writing books for them in their local languages. So a fairly traditional role for a university, even though our mission was to be a development university, to help solve problems in our local community. In 2013, as I said, the terrorist group Boko Haram arose in our backyard. In a trip in 2013 with some of my colleagues, one of the emirs of the region said to us, something's happening. The husbands in this community were burned and the boys were taken. It didn't take too long before internally displaced people started flowing into our little town of Yola. First 5,000, then 20, then 150, then 300,000. During this period, the Chibok women were also kidnapped not that far from us. So what does a university do when confronted with a humanitarian crisis, not just close by, but literally outside our gates? So we built a community organization, the university did, called the Adamawa Peace Initiative. Adamawa is the state the university is located in. And when we talk about universities cooperating with communities, it's really important. I believe it's got to be a two-way proposition. A university can't just do something to the community. Of course, you build a collaborative, respectful relationship. So out in Northeast Nigeria, members of our community, religious leaders, there were no NGOs there. So it was really mainly religious leaders identified vulnerable youth who could be recruited by Boko Haram, and the university began some really interesting community engagement projects. These are some of the young people who were running, who were on their own and had lost touch with their families, orphans and refugees. Those are the university gates right there. With my students and faculty, we began to do some pretty creative community engagement, beginning to feed these young people and make sure that they had a basic education for boys and, of course, for the most vulnerable, who are girls. The food issue became huge, and the entire university, students, faculty, and staff began feeding refugees who had no food. The international community didn't understand what was occurring in our backyard. Students, faculty, and staff designed something called Peace Through Sport so that Christian and Muslim youth who may have been in conflict north of us, went through a peace curriculum and learned to play together and learn about each other's cultures and religious traditions. Every Thursday, university students and staff and faculty fed about this many people. So it was really a major community effort for a little university in Northeast Nigeria. But here's what also began happening. And when we talk about community engagement, this is critically important. Every university, school, and department began designing courses to make sure that particularly refugees had education. And here's how I think we need to think very clearly about community engagement. It's not just community service. Students learn the most when the projects they're designing are deeply integrated into the classroom. So my journalism students wrote radio shows that 20,000 listened to. Our computer science student designed apps on tablet computers and on apps for students who are refugees who had no schools to go to. Everyone got involved in doing the research to determine whether or not this technology-enhanced learning for all was working, and it was. Students and faculty, with their community engagement and working on these huge problems, confronted great problems and found solutions. And here's what I learned from that experience. As I said, every school at the university developed a required course that responded to the crisis. The courses have evolved over time out in Nigeria, but it's that third point that really has forced me to do some deep thinking about community engagement. When students, when young people are confronted with great challenges like we faced in Nigeria, and they have a classroom to go back to reflect on what they've seen and to design solutions, they become leaders. The young people who experience that, and this was the student government vice president at the time, Grace, he's now running for office in Uganda. Many of those students from computer science are the ones who designed the Lagos Tech Hub. So the connection I'm trying to make is, I think when we give students in universities very big problems to solve, if we do it well, they have the knowledge and skills that we need for these big challenges facing them, but also the courage and confidence to know that they can make a huge difference. Dickinson College, much closer to home. Before the pandemic began, and I think this might have some relevance to the U.S., because of what I learned in Nigeria, that you don't wait to establish these community groups, we established something called CAN, the Carlisle Action Network. Carlisle is where Dickinson is located. We started with a dozen community groups. We were about a month or 2 months into these meetings when the pandemic started. And we went online, and those dozen organizations turned into 90, including people with very different interests and different perspectives. Our Republican state legislator, a conservative woman, Democratic political leaders from the governor's office, faith-based organizations. The U.S. Army War College is located in Carlisle, and their commandant became a key leader of this community-based engagement. The local hospitals and the homeless shelters, we all came together, and I think this is an important thing that needs to happen more in America, and universities can drive this. But working together and with our students and faculty, we made sure no one went hungry, people could get out to get their vaccines, and education was supported by the Dickinson students tutoring online for vulnerable children in the region. So in my view, university-led civic learning and action projects are essential for our communities in America and around the world. They prepare leaders, solve problems, bridge differences, which we need everywhere in the world right now, and work for the common good. And finally, as I mentioned, we had almost all of the Chibok women who escaped and many who were rescued later. One graduated last year, and I asked her what the AUN education meant to her. To me, her words define what civic engagement is, and what it should be for all students. She said education, the education she'd had at AUN, gave her the wings to fly, the power to fight, and the voice to speak. And I wish those words and that approach for all students. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Margee. And you know, it's been a pleasure. I had read about the amazing work that Margee had done, and then to get to know her as the president of AUBG over the last few months, and as a proud alumna of New College at Florida, has been really wonderful. It's also great to be here with Grace, who attended our annual Civic Engagement Conference in Budapest this year, and to see what a wonderful product of a great liberal education can do. So I'm going to talk a little bit, offer a few sort of theoretical groundings on some of the areas about this. And I want to stress again, there's a Q&A function here at the bottom of your screen. So when I'm done, if you have questions, please, post them in the Q&A, and we will do a good job, or our best job, of responding to them. I think we're probably, I'm going to have a short PowerPoint. I think we're both probably most comfortable speaking to people and not just, working off of PowerPoints and so forth. But that's where we're going to be heading right now. So let me offer a brief PowerPoint, and then we'll take questions in the Q&A. And we really appreciate the many people who have joined us, whether it's early or late. And I know some of you people in Europe that the time changed, so everyone's moving around trying to sort through this, and we appreciate your presence. One of the interesting things for me is that I think we're good, that I direct BART Center for Civic Engagement, and increasingly have been trying to write and conceptualize the role of universities as civic actors. And I'll talk a little bit about that experience, both from BARD and the Open Society University Network, in my brief talk. So universities we often talk about different areas of engagement. One of them is about a student as citizen. And I think Martha Nussbaum captures this really well when she talks about higher education cultivating the whole human being for functions of citizenship and life in general. That is, education, as Margee said, is not just to train a narrow group of, workers, as is increasingly sort of the mantra of neoliberal approach to education, but a liberal education, which is represented by the American University of Bulgaria, American University of Nigeria, Bard College, and New College, Florida. All the folk here tries to cultivate the full citizen. And as Bart Giamatti, former president of Yale, said, how we choose to believe and speak and treat others, how we choose a civic role for ourselves, is the deepest purpose of a liberal education and the act of teaching. And I want to say that earlier today, I was on a call of fellows from the Center of Liberal Arts and Sciences Pedagogy as part of the Open Society University Network, speaking to faculty from about 20 different institutions who really care about how pedagogy shapes students. I think as we're thinking about student as citizen, that is working with and training students, we're talking about developing not just knowledge in so a subject, but developing these deep critical thinking skills, capacities to carefully read texts, verbal and writing skills, as well as the confidence and courage that Margee mentioned in her talk. We might also be emphasizing civic knowledge, that is the basics of operating in the communities locally, nationally, and globally, so that people don't just have general capacities that cut across different areas, but that they know about tools of power and how they can impact those communities. Here today, we're talking more about an institution as a citizen. And again, here, I think there is a clash to some extent between a view of universities, sort of a neoliberal model of universities, which is taking a very narrow view of them, de-emphasizing things like social sciences and humanities and the arts to try to focus on a narrow area that we are only involved in this, and that we will only be engaged in a very narrow range of educational processes that is training a next generation of workers. And this view was captured perhaps best by Ira Harkavy and others in Dewey's Dreams, when he talked about, to become part of the solution, education institutions must give full-hearted, full-minded devotion to the painfully difficult task of transforming themselves into socially responsible civic universities and colleges. So what do we mean by this? Universities as civic actors, to me, is devoting the resources, financial, intellectual, moral, and reputational, to engage with and make a difference in society. And we say society, we are talking again, local, national, and global. So let me look at some areas of activities that might be involved. One of them, I think, which is critically important, is making education accessible. That is, particularly focusing on making education accessible to communities and people who have traditionally been excluded from higher education. These exclusions might have occurred due to socioeconomic status. And here, for example, I'm very proud of our work with ATI, a group led by Cappy Hill, former president of Vassar College, which is pushing U.S. institutions to accept more Pell-eligible students, that is, students in the lowest economic quintile. So Bard College, where I work, accepts about 26% of our student body are people in this lowest economic quintile. It relates to religious and ethnic minorities, people who might have been excluded in the past, and even now, of course, due to their religion or their status within communities. And here again, I could point to, and this often, of course, often overlaps with socioeconomic status as well. And BARD has a number of programs, which I'm very proud of, which address some of these things, including the BARD early colleges, we have 9 of them in the United States, which are public early colleges where students in their final 2 years of high school are getting their associate's degree, which is their first 2 years of a college education. These are education at public institutions and are free and give these students the chance to get a credential, the associate's degree, and has a huge amount of success in terms of helping people to graduate from university in 4 years. In some of our locations, we have 95% of the students are on federally subsidized school lunch programs. That is an example of that. Another example is BARD runs the largest degree-granting prison education program in the country, where we're working with incarcerated students who are studying the same courses as they do at BARD College, getting the same degrees as they would at BARD College, and having a wonderful impact on a population which has been so neglected in the past. Other examples might be displaced students. And again, we have tried to incorporate, we have 75 students from Afghanistan, 26 students from Ukraine, 12 students from Russia, and have made a lot of efforts there. I could say the American University of Central Asia, where I was acting president the past 2 years, has made a wonderful impact there. That is, again, providing rigorous higher education to communities which may not have had that opportunity. And the final area I want to point out here in terms of accessibility is supporting students from institutions which are the object of assault for either ideological reasons or political reasons, and are struggling to continue the education at least as they once knew it. And here, BARD and the Open Society University Network have been involved with places like the American University of Afghanistan, or Parami University in Myanmar, or with the Central European University, we founded the Invisible University for Ukraine. And one of the reasons why we worked with folk from New College of Florida and other institutions in Florida and the United States is similar reasons, which is that either students or faculty are facing challenges of teaching subjects or reaching students in areas of tremendous conflict or imposition of ideological restrictions. And part of the efforts of Alta Liberal Arts are to provide opportunities for people to engage in subject matters which they may not hear at their institution on a regular basis. A second area is facilitating what I mentioned as student to citizen. This is a second area which universities as citizens can do. And there, Margee spoke of many of these areas. So, for example, providing community-based learning, as she did so brilliantly at the American University of Nigeria. And not just in areas of displaced people, but there's a huge amount of data which demonstrates that students learn more and learn better when they're engaging with their communities and contextualizing the subjects that they're involved with. Another area where students can be involved is, or where institutions can be involved, is supporting student-led initiatives. That is supporting student to citizen by encouraging students to lead their own initiatives within the communities and having an impact based on programs that they may themselves design. And here, I could point to some examples at BARD, which I think are really super important. For example, I mentioned previously the Bard Prison Initiative. And this is a case where a student initiated a project, which then became an institutional project. So a student 20-some years ago had this idea of providing tutoring and then finally education to incarcerated individuals, students who had been deprived the chance to study after the policies of the Clinton administration in the United States. And in that instance, the student developed a program which reached incarcerated individuals. Then the institution adopted that as a program. And in an ideal world, we're talking about things that I refer to as virtuous circles, where students begin a project and then the university institution picks it up. And in that way, we're not only supporting students in their activity, but we're facilitating the opportunity for universities to be civic actors. Another wonderful example of that is a program at Bard called Brothers at Bard, now known as Brothers at, which is a achievement program for young men of color in the United States, and has a tremendous impact in terms of success rates of young men of color graduating institutions and having a more robust educational experience. A third area, which is a growing area in which universities can act as citizens, is in supporting faculty as engaged teachers and research. Engaged teachers, that is supporting community-based learning and providing resources to expand upon that. But research is an area of increasing importance in which universities are able to develop, to study, to engage with communities, to be encouraged by communities to study certain areas which might ameliorate problems within their communities. Those might be air pollution or things related to the SDGs about which Margee spoke, or more narrow projects where you're taking the expertise of the university and not imposing it on the community, but listening to the community and engaging with the community and learning from the community as you're developing proposals and recommendations to address societal problems. And then you are sharing those results with the communities. And then finally, an important area which I'm working to contextualize more is defending core rights of students as a class of people. And here I'm referring to experience Bard has had in particular with voting rights. Students in Annandale and Hudson, New York, where we're situated, were systematically denied the right to vote. That is, the 26th Amendment, which lowered the voting age from 21 to 18, was being ignored by local officials. This is a common thing in the United States. I'm teaching a class right now, what we call a network collaborative class, with 3 historically Black colleges and universities, with Tuskegee University, with North Carolina A&T University, and with Prairie View A&M University. And what we're seeing in this class is the targeting of young people as a class and students as a class of voters. And in this instance, Bard was able to, in collaborating with students and collaborating with non-governmental organizations, marshal the resources, both financial, intellectual, to challenge local authorities who were violating the law. And over 25 years, we were able to, through conceptualizing the university as a civic actor, win 4 lawsuits, 3 federal, 1 state. 3 state, 1 federal. In the last lawsuits, participants in the lawsuits included students, our Dean for Civic Engagement, Aaron KEENAN, our Vice President for Civic Engagement, Aaron KEENAN, and the President of Bard College, Leon Botstein, to challenge illegitimate actions which were restricting students' rights. But these might happen elsewhere. It might be about students' loans. It might be about rights of international students. It might be about rights of displaced people who are also students. And I think in those areas, I feel very comfortable for the university lending its resources and intellectual capacity to advocate on behalf of its students. I want to add one more area here, and this speaks to a lot of what Margee was talking about, which is as university as frontline responders. I had the pleasure of being in a conference last week in Spain, in Madrid, Spain, with several universities from across the globe, led by universities from the Global South, working together with the Talwar Network to discuss this concept of university as frontline responders. And as you see here, it's universities contributing to immediate interventions to short-term crises, which might be war, pandemic, civil conflict, natural disasters, and offering a long-term commitment to address the most pressing social needs facing communities. I think universities conceptualizing themselves, and COVID brought this out, given the amazing work that they've done, including the type of work that Margee described that Dickinson College did in responding to these global challenges. Most of the people speaking of that were from the Global South, from American University of Beirut, which does amazing programs in response to challenging social needs, including a situation of displaced and folk after the huge explosion that happened there last year. So I think in this other area that we conceptualize of universities as civic actors is this as universities as frontline responders. I finally wanted to mention, because I represent in part the Open Society University Network, that is networks of universities as civic actors. And I think here it's really important as global citizens that networks of universities could band together to support students and academic institutions in need. And here we again have examples that I mentioned before. When there were students from Open Society University Network institutions stranded in Kabul, we banded together Bard College, the Open Society Foundations, the American University of Central Asia, the American University of Afghanistan, to help students from those institutions, as well as the Central European University and the American University of Beirut, to escape Kabul so that they could continue their education. What we did was something that only a network can do. Open Society University Network, as I said, has banded together to offer courses through the Central European University to displaced students from Ukraine, as well as students who are currently there, to provide students education for students from Myanmar, whose education had been challenged as well. So that is really, really a network of institutions can band together to support institutions which are facing these challenges better than individual institutions can. And we're increasingly seeing cooperation between global North and global South institutions in this regard. So political scientists, which I am, always ask the so what question, so I thought I'd ask that. And here I want to answer in a few ways. One of them is that institutions in acting as civically engaged actors, not only do we make an impact on communities locally, nationally, and globally, but we also model behavior. We model behavior in two ways. One of them is we model behavior of students. Anyone who has sat through a graduation ceremony hears about how students should go forth and change the world. And in mission statements, it's talking about that. But when they look at their institutions and they see their institutions indifferent to challenges in their local and national communities, those claims ring hollow. I think we can model behavior both of our student body, but also model behavior of other academic institutions. One of the reasons why Bard College took in so many students from Afghanistan was to try to set a model for other American institutions. And these are examples of local American colleges where students were pressing their institutions to act more like other institutions, to step up. A second area is in terms of public policy impacts, which is that our engagement in education can make a big difference in society. So in prison education, one of the amazing things about the Bard Prison Initiative was that recidivism rates for students, that is, people, the frequency with which students who participated in the program and were let out of prison, returned to prison, were dramatically lower than the norm. So if the norm is in the 50 to 60% range, in the Bard Prison Initiative, incarcerated students who participated in that were in the 2.5 to 4% range. And that helped change the entire debate within the United States Congress about how we treat incarcerated individuals. I will say that I am often not a big fan of things that happened under the Trump administration. And yet under the Trump administration, they extended Pell Grants to incarcerated individuals, which I think is really important. A similar case is in early colleges, where we see huge, the top two high schools in New York State for producing graduates within 4 years of public institutions of people coming from the lowest economic quintile are the Bard High School Early College Queens, the Bard High School Early College Manhattan. Again, really important. The last example is in terms of voting rights, where Bard, through a series of lawsuits, not only secured the rights of students to vote on campus, to vote and to vote on campus, but last year New York State passed a law which mandated, which we advocated for with other organizations, which mandated that any college campus with 300 or more registered voters can have a polling place on campus. And I'm very happy to say that next Tuesday, Bard students will be voting at our campus center rather than at a small church 1.5 miles away from campus. And the other thing is about the enriching the academic experience, as Margee mentioned. What we do as a civically engaged institution models behavior, creates access, but it also enriches our own students. I show this picture. These are 2 students from Bard last year who won Rhodes scholarships, one from Bard College Annandale, who is a refugee from Afghanistan, one from Bard College Berlin, who was a Syrian refugee. These are not, in doing this, we are not providing charity. We're enhancing the learning of our students on campus and improving our liberal arts classroom. The enrichment that goes on from community-engaged learning, from student-led initiatives, from initiatives which diversify our educational community, those are all part of improving the learning environment. Thus, by promoting universities as civic actors, we are winning in every case. We are impacting society, and we're impacting positively the educational environment in which our students are situated. I want to thank you all for sitting through our presentations. As I said before, we have time for questions and answers. I see there's some questions, and I encourage other folk to do so. Before we do that, though, maybe, Margee, I don't know if there's anything you want to say in response to what I said or beyond that, and then we can move on, and we can, Grace is with us for a bit, and perhaps Grace can choose some questions or not. But Margee, maybe do you want to respond to anything that I said?
No, thank you, Jonathan, for that really helpful conceptual framework. I mean, I think that helps everyone understand what we mean by civic learning and action. There are multiple ways it can be done. But the one thing that struck me is the incredible networks that you and your colleagues and others have set up overseas, how much they're needed in the United States right now, right? Because every university in the U.S. is doing, whether we call it community service, civic learning, and action community engagement, right? So I've always wondered, both when I was a president in America and now from abroad, and when you're abroad, you look at your country differently. And with democracy really at threat, isn't there a way to build stronger networks within the United States so we join hands to make sure that, as you say, your voting rights initiative, everyone's doing that? So we're all acting as independent actors. We're all part of different networks. We're all very busy. But as I tried to say in one side, this is a very critical moment in the history of the U.S. and the world. So why can't we come together to build networks like that in the U.S. that support democracy and the other values we believe in?
Yeah, I mean, there are like Campus Compact and all of both. There are, Andrew Goodman Foundation. Some of these exist, but it is often the case I've found. It's really interesting that you have segmented action, and often you have a nonprofit world and a university world which don't meet. So I was at an amazing conference this summer in which I was the only university leader who was there of nonprofits fighting for academic freedom. And one thing I want to say here, because talking about defending academic institutions, last October I published an article in Ethics and International Affairs in which I described the global liberal arts challenge, right? Which is how, what is the challenge to liberal arts education across the globe? And one of the things I concluded there was, look, if you look at things that are taking place in Florida, that was before things happened with New College and elsewhere, U.S. institutions should pay attention to what's going on abroad, should support institutions which are being challenged abroad, and should think, because this is coming to the United States. So I would say, it extends not just in how we are empowering students and not just in where we are defending rights, but how we are defending academic institutions writ large, especially liberal arts institutions, which both from sort of a neoliberal perspective, why do we need humanists? We need only people who can do data entry or something like that, as well as the very principles of questioning authority, which is at the root of critical thinking in many circumstances. So Grace, do you want to pose some questions? And again, we know Grace actually has class, so she's here for a bit longer, but as long as she's here, we're happy. So
yeah, I'm happy to read off some interesting questions while I've got time. One interesting one is, most recently, there has been in the USA a revival of the view that universities should not take positions on political issues. To some, the humanitarian work that Dr. Ensign described or read as political positioning of universities. This includes social justice issues such as racial equality, anti-racism. I'm interested in learning about your response to this vision that higher education institutions, different from individuals taking their own positions, should not take political positions.
Jonathan, you want to jump in? You want me to start?
why don't you begin? Then I'll follow. Yeah.
I mean, it's a really important question, right? And every institution is different in terms of how they would approach it. I see the world of a university as based first and foremost on its mission and its values. Our mission out here at the American University in Bulgaria, and it looks like we're the only university in the world that actually has the word democracy in its mission statement. So our goal is to educate democratic, ethical leaders for this society and the region and the world. If democracy is under threat, then I think it is based on our values and our mission to speak out and not only do the incredible work that we're doing in communities, but to make sure we are consistently speaking out for the value of democracy. So institutions, like individuals, I believe, are and can be and should be values driven. So when those values are under threat, I see a very definite role for that. The mission of the American University of Nigeria was to be a development university. So everything that we did out there was to try to solve problems and create young people who could solve those huge problems. So I see those two going hand in hand. Jonathan?
Yeah, I will say as a university leader, this is the most difficult intellectually thing I think we faced in some time, trying to figure out when to speak out and when not to speak out. And, I could say, I tell some people, because as the Vice Chancellor of the Open Society University Network, there is not a week that goes by that something important doesn't happen in one of the countries in which we're engaged. So the situation in Israel, Palestine, Gaza is the most obvious one of recent memory. But the same week that occurred, 100,000 Armenians were pushed out of Nagorno-Karabakh, and there was an earthquake in Herat. And tried to figure out what you say and when is super difficult. I think what I would say here is, first of all, that I think our actions are the most important thing that we could do, right?
Yeah.
So, when we talk about the situation in Palestine, BARD is of 5,000 American colleges and universities. BARD runs the only dual degree program with the Palestinian institution, Al-Quds BARD, something I'm very proud of. We probably have more Palestinian graduates than any other American institutions in the United States. Still, for people, they want a more robust statement. I say our statement is our action. That's the most important thing we could do. When we're talking about racial equality, we could point to, BARD in Annandale is a predominantly white institution. That is where we're situated, 2 hours north of New York City. But if you add people from the BARD Prison Initiative, if you add people from the BARD early colleges, we are not a predominantly white institution. That is a majority of people who take classes for credit are African American, and if you look at it, that is the action that we're taking, which speaks to our values. So I feel like a lot of people who weigh in with lofty words aren't doing anything or aren't doing enough, and particularly aren't doing enough given American institutions. There are some institutions which, as I say, have more money in their couch cushions than we have in our endowment. And yet, what are they doing in the world? And so, again, I'm not, so the final thing is, when should we speak? When should we act? I'm trying to conceptualize this, and I'm wrestling with myself all the time. But I think as things which most impact our students and or institutions as classes of entities, students as a class of individuals, the voting rights thing was students were targeted for being students. And therefore, we should say something. Not everyone agrees with that. Neighboring institutions who advertise themselves as fearlessly consequential, super bold, whatever, and their slogans did nothing in that regard. And I totally disagree with that. So again, I think that there's an appropriate place, and the most appropriate place of speaking is where it's affecting our students and faculty or institutions. Going beyond that gets a little bit complicated, but our actions are much more important than our words. And hollow words, which aren't backed up by action, tend to be hollow words.
Very nice.
If I could jump in, Sadie, just one last comment on that. I mean, I completely agree with you, Jonathan. Really, in the end, it's about actions and impact and living our mission and our values. But I find it surprising that so few people perhaps in the U.S. and other places don't know what universities like yours and mine are doing. When we talk about the debate about the role of higher education, there seems to be an assumption that we're not doing this kind of work. We're not having an impact. We're not working in communities like you are so effectively. So I think that's another piece of it that should be talked about a lot more, the impact of higher education institutions in our communities.
Very nice. So I've got another question for you. The authoritarian attack on liberal education is especially difficult for many public institutions because they are heavily dependent upon financial support from the state. Can you point to examples of public institutions successfully resisting government pressure and serving as civic actors in the manner of Bard and Dickinson?
Let me speak to that for a moment. One of the great things that I'm experiencing this semester is teaching a class, and I'm going to say thank you to Grace, who's going to class, which is what she should be doing.
Thank you, Grace.
But I'm teaching a class, as I mentioned, on voting rights. It's looking at the 26th Amendment as a prism through which to examine the history of voting rights in the United States. And I'm doing it with faculty from 3 historically Black colleges and universities. And I would encourage anyone who's watching to read a book by Jelani Favors, who's one of the faculty members, called Shelter in a Time of Storm. And Shelter in a Time of Storm it's a history of historically Black colleges and universities in the United States. And I'm very sympathetic to it, in part because I'm an administrator, and it's talking about the challenges that administrators face when you're stuck between a rock and a hard place, which is students who you have trained, right, who you have educated and who are at the cutting edge of social change, and you as an institution, which are responsible often, because many HBCUs in the United States are state institutions. And I think his description of that is really brilliant. He talks about creating a second curriculum, which is saying one thing is, regardless of what your first curriculum is, the second curriculum is educating young people who will go on to change the world. That is Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King Jr., many of the leaders of the civil rights movement in the United States were trained at historically Black colleges and universities who were making choices. The second thing is leaders can support by not opposing, and they can support in quiet ways the activity of students. So even if the president of Tuskegee University was not signing on to a lawsuit, there was a very important lawsuit called Gamillion, which was on gerrymandering related and situated in Tuskegee, Alabama. He passively supported the professor who did this. And he did it by actually moving around titles of the professor from job to job, title to title, and let it be known where he stood to the professor who followed on this. And Tuskegee actually, some of their state funds were revoked for that on the one hand. On the other hand, few enough that the case was so important that they felt it was worth it. So there are ways in which, and then things like voting rights, to me, that's a no-brainer. A public university, if students' rights are being violated, which was the case here, I don't care whether you're state or not, you should be standing up for principles and speaking out that way. So his book captured these nuances, and I will say it was not without cost. Some of the university leaders, even Charles Gamillion, who led the fight for voting rights in Tuskegee, Alabama, who was the subject of one of the most important Supreme Court cases on gerrymandering, was called by a next generation of students an Uncle Tom, which was, incredibly hurtful. And yet the legacy of him goes well beyond those individual wounds. So, of course, as an administrator, I appreciate Jelani as a faculty member's books and acknowledging these difficulties. It is not easy, and yet public universities can be more bold than they can. And there's other people as well. I mean, I will say the student leaders of state universities should and could be speaking out if you're in a state which is restricting discussion of some subjects, as I think is happening in the case of in Florida, where both Margee and Grace studied. So that's what I say. So Margee.
No, I don't have much to add to that, Jonathan. I thought that was really thoughtful, particularly your last points about the role of students and faculty speaking out and working with community groups on these important topics. So I thought that was a really thoughtful response.
I think we have to marshal.
Oh, we have to take the question.
Do this. So let me pose a question what do you see as the relationship between liberal education specifically and civic engagement? The points of connections to civic engagement seems potentially very different depending on the kinds of institutions that are rolling up their proverbial sleeves.
I'm sorry, Jonathan, I didn't get the question.
Okay, sorry. It's one in the chat.
I'm looking at it.
Yeah, okay.
So why don't I start with that first one about lifelong learning, right?
Okay, sure.
That's a critically important part of education, right? To create that culture of lifelong learning, and New College certainly did that with its emphasis. So the question was, are there structured opportunities that could be designed for cross-generational engagement? I think that's so important, and it's happening at many universities, and not just with alums, but with community leaders and with others in communities. And of course, young people learn so much from that cross-generational experience. So I don't see anything conflicting there. I see that only contributing to a liberal education and to deepening ties in terms of civic engagement. Jonathan?
Yeah, so this question is asking about, again, I think we're going to just go down those series of questions, which will be a little bit easier. So, lifelong learning opportunities, I think, intergenerational learning is really important, and increasing number of colleges and universities are creating models which allow for that, as well as models which, through community-based learning, students are engaged with the elder population, which as I get older, I'm much more sympathetic to, I have to be very honest. Bard has a wonderful Lifetime Learning Institute, which brings elderly learners onto campus, and they contribute quite a bit. But if we're going to be, a genuinely, open society and learn, that is one of the demographics we need to learn from. The next question, just going down, asks about universities as frontline responders who should contribute to immediate interventions. And the question is, in what way should they contribute? What does this mean? I'm going to let Margee talk about this a little bit, because she described that, I think, really effectively.
Well, and again, the crisis was outside our door. And our question as a university was, and I had to pose this to students and faculty and staff, do you want to shut down and those of you who live overseas evacuate, or do you want to take on this enormous, almost unbelievable and unsolvable problem of 300,000 hungry people in our community? So that's what it meant to be a frontline responder. No one said, I want to go home. No student said, I'd rather not be here. So that alone was an incredible commitment. And as I tried to say in my brief presentation, was those young people who had to respond to unimaginable situations, I didn't even get into most of them, they're now the leaders in that big, important society that will be the third largest in the world. So there are millions of examples of immediate responders, whether it's a natural disaster and a university has resources to support, whether it's internally displaced people, whether it's refugees, whether it's climate refugees. But, as I tried to say in the beginning, I think a big part of our role as a university is to serve also the community that we live in, and then broader in terms of the global society. And especially at this moment in history, I believe this is a critically important mission and role for institutions of higher education.
I think that Margee touched on the main answers. The one thing I would say is, some universities have medical schools, right? Some universities have legal clinics. I think one thing that all universities, though, do is they educate people. And In thinking about that, I think universities are strongest when, the closer things are to education, the best off universities are engaging. So I think Margee's talk not simply about bringing in people from disadvantaged communities, but employing or deploying students and faculty to educate people from underserved communities, to present them or prepare them for future education is so important. And reaching out into the world to do that at times of crisis in particular is really important. I know our partners, the American University of Beirut, have done amazing work in that regard. But they also have done amazing work in other things like designing low-cost housing for people, for displaced populations, and taking advantage of the other tools of that. So I think it's a really, I will say with the Talwar Network, the Open Society University Network is really focusing on this issue. And I think that you'll be seeing, we heard 6 case studies from across the globe last week, which were really super impressive. And I think we'll be producing more written materials in that regard coming up, which should further define this as we go forward.
So Jonathan, if I could just jump in, I think I'm trying to make an additional point from you. Yes, our main role is education, right? And how we do that and what subjects students are allowed to take and all of that is critically important. I have come to believe, based on my experiences, particularly in Nigeria and even what we experienced at Dickinson, that one of the ways to educate young people to be prepared for the world they will live in, that we probably won't live in, is to allow them encourage, and perhaps require as part of their education that they take on a very big problem, whether it's in a local community or bigger. Because I have seen firsthand when students have the knowledge and skills, they develop through those kinds of activities the courage and confidence they need to solve these enormous issues that we're facing. So I think I'm pushing it a little farther than you are, perhaps.
Yes, and this is great. We sort of think alike on a lot of things, so it's good when we have a slight disagreement. So let me just what I was trying to say is something slightly different from that. So I agree with that. And I think I'm thinking about universities as actors intervening. And what I am trying to say there is that when universities are intervening in if you're viewing social action through education, right, that is something that almost every institution can do. So Bard doesn't have a medical school. So when there's COVID, our capacity to produce respirators, as our partners at Al-Quds Bard did, or do what MIT did in massive testing, that isn't so great. And yet we can, in inner cities or we have this wonderful program which we sponsor called the Clemente Course in the Humanities, which provides rigorous humanities education to underserved communities across the United States of adults. We can intervene there with comfort, or an early college education. So the question I would ask is, why is Bard College in Cleveland, Ohio, doing early college education for primarily disadvantaged youth, providing a pathway to a free associate's degree? And why isn't, other famous liberal arts institutions not far away doing that? And so I agree with you about the broadening of the educational, but I'm thinking about the various actions that institutions could do. And since all institutions are involved in education, and since in pretty much any community you could imagine there's a need for education, if we're looking at sort of concentric circles, the starting point to me would be education. There's other things that one may choose to do. I totally agree, though, that in shaping the student as citizen parts, shaping future citizens, that involving students in these projects is better for them. And all the results, all the data show that their outcomes are better, too, in terms of their learning. So we should, we're doing good and doing well. So all at the same time.
Okay. The next question is about funding, which is a good one. I mean, there are certainly, as you well know, there are institutions, there are donors, there are foundations that support civic engagement, but I'm sure at Bard and at AUBG, at AUN, and at Dickinson, the university, since this is a core mission of the 3 universities I've been associated with, we provide university resources. It's integrated into how we fund the education for students. So at AUBG, our Center for Information, Democracy, and Citizenship, right now is part of the university budget, and students participate in projects through that. So I'm sure it's similar at Bard. There's some internal resources, there's some external, There are some great foundations that you know well, that I know, that believe this is their mission as a foundation to support civic engagement.
Yeah, I would say, there are people who are interested in supporting specific projects that you're doing as well, because there are, impacting communities of which there might be great interest. There's support from within the communities themselves. One of our greatest funders is Nick Asienzo, who is a local high school teacher who ended up making money through running an ice cream stand in the summers. And he has donated his money to local engagements. When we were involved in local elections, they were unyielding in their support of us. And it was really wonderful. I would say, sometimes it's almost the reverse, that I worry that people don't want to fund, Shakespeare or whatever else you may be studying. Yeah. And they're more interested in some of the more narrow projects. It isn't easy, but at least in the sort of civic engagement area, you could point to specific projects that are supporting, that are supporting constituencies and activities that people want to support. I do think that in many instances, this is where you get into some dilemmas where the state might be more involved. And here there's differences between sort of North America and other parts of the world, in Europe, where the state supports more core education, less now than it used to be, but they still do that. So there are some questions associated with that. But I do think that there's questions about both. Higher education funding, especially for liberal arts institutions, is not such an easy thing as people become more sort of neoliberal and in their outlook. But there are different ways of approaching that, and I think that we're proud of our outcomes, and because of our outcomes, we think people tend to support some of that a bit more.
So the next one poses the question, is there a tension between, as if I read it correctly, making sure students have the knowledge and the skills that they need for their professions and a liberal arts education? I mean, I think the data is pretty clear that what you learn in a liberal arts education, to think critically, to not answer questions, but to figure out, first of all, how to structure the questions. And maybe most importantly, for the big issues I see facing us as humanity, to think across disciplines, right? None of the issues we talk about fits in a discipline. None of the solutions fit in a discipline. So a liberal arts education, by definition, teaches people to think, to have different perspectives, to think across disciplines. And that's what's needed for the careers of now and the future. So I see less tension there. I worry about people who are trained narrowly in coding, in careers that now, are being, becoming, based more on AI, and the solutions are not, individuals working in those areas, but it's technology driving it. So I don't know how you feel about that, but Jonathan, but I think we've got to keep pushing for educations that stay open, that ask the hard questions, that allow people to question everything, and then to definitely think across disciplines to come up with great ideas and solutions to move us forward.
Right. Yeah. I mean, look, there's just to echo, I think what Margee said, that there's a large amount of data which shows that the core skills that people are getting in a liberal arts and sciences education will, especially the capacity to learn, right? To read and to reinvent themselves, will sustain people throughout their lives. So one doesn't want to reduce liberal education, I think, to these, like do it because you'll get a job. But nonetheless, you have to defend yourself against people, including parents and the state, which is saying, why should we read books? And there is, I did a really interesting, or what I think is interesting, article looking at employment outcomes for liberal arts graduates in different places around the globe. And you consistently see good outcomes. In the Netherlands, you see, which is probably the biggest adopter of liberal education outside of the United States, you see immense success, both in terms of completing university and in terms of employment outcomes and educational outcomes for graduates. We saw Bart ran a wonderful program with St. Petersburg State University for 25 years before we were banned. And the employment outcomes of the graduates for that were amazing. At the American University of Central Asia, if you compare graduates of AUCA and their employment outcomes to graduates of other institutions, you see a higher percentage graduating, and as well as at Al-Quds Bard, our program in East Jerusalem. I think that that the other thing we have to acknowledge is that, you know, the employment universe of people is different than it was, you know, when Margee and I were in university. And people will shift jobs in many more times than they will than they previously did. And those enduring skills, and again, the capacity to learn, you know, I refer to something in an article I wrote as the liberal arts wager, and that is the capacity to think critically and to learn will, over the lifetime of a student, do them better than the specific knowledge they might have in one area, which now is often far more ephemeral in terms of what people can do. So I feel confident in that regard, and I feel confident in terms of data globally, especially globally, which shows the success of this approach to education.
I'm afraid the next one is a question for me. I don't really like, I think we just lost it. Can you go back?
The next question is it's still there. If you scroll up, you'll see it. It is for you.
Okay. So I don't really want to talk about my own leadership development, but I will just say that for me, you know, taking a job before, as I look at, as I have in my past, looking at becoming a president of an institution, the mission and vision and values really, really matter, right? So Dickinson, a useful education for the common good. The American University of Nigeria, be a development university. So I took that very seriously. And when people started arriving outside our gates, I felt that was our mission. And so there was no conflict with putting university resources and raising resources, right? It didn't just come from the university. Finally, after a time, the U.S. government, while they couldn't come up to see us because it was a conflict zone, resources started coming in. And so I am afraid my leadership style is do what you think is right based on what you learned with that great liberal education and ask for forgiveness later. And if you've done the wrong thing, you'll learn in a hurry. But if you have hungry people outside your gates, if you have children who need an education, I think it only makes sense to respond in that way. It's the same out here at AUBG, whose mission is democracy and ethical leaders. So it probably doesn't really answer your question, why do we do some of the things that we do? I mean, I think my leadership is driven by answering a question. How can you have the biggest impact at this moment in time? Fortunately, I've had boards and people who've supported those decisions. I will tell you the scariest moment was when we brought all those Chibok women to the university. And I hadn't really asked for permission for that because we weren't supposed to be up in that part of the country. And we didn't have the money to educate them. And they needed everything. They arrived in that bus. We brought them with a plastic bag with maybe one thing in it. They had nothing. And that night, I worried a lot about where the money was going to come from. And sometimes there are angels in the world. And an American who probably doesn't want me to mention him called me that night. And not that night, sorry, because no one knew for a while, but called me over time and said, I know you have them there. Tell me what money you need to educate them. So there are just great people out in the world who want to do good. And I think that's an important message if there are any students on this call. The challenges are great, but there's so many good people out there trying to solve them. And they seem to be attracted to things where they feel they can make a difference. So jump in and do it if you think it's the right thing to do, and it'll make a difference and improve people's lives.
I want to say, so the question, just to read, part of the question, it was directed more towards Margee than me, but what advice would you give young leaders on how to make leadership decisions that mean taking bigger risks? And I think, you know, some of the answer is being tolerant of failure and being tolerant of failure of students. You know, as university administrator, as somebody who teaches classes on civic engagement, I'm constantly faced with, you know, students who I've trained in my class protesting me, right? And when that happens, I'm always a combination of, you know, horrified and proud, right? And on the one hand, you just wish it would disappear because you have 19,000 other things to do. On the other hand, you're like, okay, these young people are expressing themselves, and be tolerant that, as a parent now of, somebody just graduated university last year and a senior, accepting that as people are finding their voices may not be perfect the first time, just as our voices are not perfect the first time. So modeling behavior, but being tolerant, being encouraging, listening, and try to thoughtfully engage is really important. And I think sharing stories, like Margee has done, of things that we've done which have succeeded and failed. All of us have had failures, right? It is okay to fail. It hurts tremendously to fail. But it's also, if you learn and share, I love talking. Like, one of the most important talks I gave in my life, the most important talk I gave very early in my life, I had the opportunity of being on a stage at Foreign Schwarzenberg in Vienna with the Austrian foreign minister, Erhard Busek, and George Soros. This was in 94, I think it was. And the only comment my students gave to me, my colleagues gave to me after the talk, was that I drank a lot of water. I was so nervous. I was just sitting there drinking, and it happened. It's okay. So in any event, I think it is, what is the worst? I try to tell people the worst that happens from an epic fail, well, not quite the worst, but often is you have a story of how you failed, right? Obviously you don't want to harm other people, and that is super important as you're thinking about what you're doing. But I think that being willing to listen, being empathetic to university students as they're trying to find their voice, being tolerant of that is really important. And as, again, hearkening back to what Jelani said in his book, you're training a generation of people who will be the leaders in the future. And even if you don't see it at that moment, knowing that they will make a difference in the long run, I think is really, really super important.
So Stephen's asked several questions, I've noticed. Should we jump down a little? Stephen, we'll come back to you if you're still on. Okay, what is Juliana saying? I'm worried about mission creep. Dr. Ensign, how universities can be responders. Dr. Becker, being flexible is the exception, not the norm. Jonathan, do you want to talk about mission creep?
I think I will try that. I mean, I think the question is, it's rooted in, because not everyone could see these, so I'm going to just repeat this. Yeah. They're talking about how universities acting as frontline responders or civically engaged institutions, I think, can take you away from core educational principles. And also, how in secondary education and K through 12 education, you might run into difficulties trying to expand these types of activities there. And so I guess what I would say is that there are always challenges associated with this, that you don't want, if a university is only acting as a social actor, if it's only making huge pronouncements on global issues, that you're missing some of the other types of activities. So what are the responses? The responses are, first of all, through your curriculum, which should be well-rounded. And that I like the, liberal educational approach. I never studied at a liberal arts institution, by the way. I never studied in the United States either. The idea of having this as part of your curriculum, I think, is really important. I think recognizing that many of the things that you do enhance educational opportunity and enhance the education of students grounds you, as Margee has so passionately spoken about, grounds you in the educational mission of the institution. As far as K through 12 education is concerned, there are some very good articles which talk about when civic engagement is meaningful and when it isn't. And having a discussion about that with students, I think, really helps. And there are, sort of the analogy that the Kahn and Westheimer wrote a very good article in American Political Science Association about this. And they taught, give an analogy, which is like you could buy a good from the, from a baking sale to support a social good. You could organize a bake sale for a social good, or you could discuss the underlying causes of hunger, which animate why you're doing this bake sale, for example. And I think we as educators want to bear in mind, first of all, that different people might be in different points of their life when they can engage, but that we want to look not just at proximate issues, but underlying issues. And in looking at underlying issues, I think we're servicing our communities. What concerns me so much is in places like Florida, like Tennessee, like Texas, where you are effectively banning or frightening faculty from engaging in issues which are very relevant for society, right? Why is there such economic disparity between African Americans and other Americans? And if you're not able to talk about enslavement or redlining or discrimination, what are you as an intellectual? Now, you can argue about the relevance or the impact or the degree or what have you, or you could argue about public policy prescriptions, but to deny discussing that or to make fearful teachers about discussing issues because they could be held criminally liable, that strikes me as very thoughtless and not encouraging of the reflective types of citizens that we want. So I think there is a balance there, but I think that we as teachers want to delve into these areas. I'm very proud, I will just add this for people in Florida, that the Bard Early Colleges are offering free online education in subjects which have been effectively curtailed by the state, focusing on the history of African Americans, as well as psychology because of the concern about them dealing with gender issues. So, there is a balance, but I think that we as educators, we're preparing a future generation. We don't want to have closed zones of discussion. We want to look at underlying causes, not just proximate issues. And I think if we don't do that, we're doing a disservice to our students, and we're not producing a next generation of engaged citizens that we speak about wanting to do.
I completely agree with everything you've said. There's just one other point that be considered is that students can also be teachers, right? So it isn't just about faculty. You've talked about that, students being involved in their communities. I'm sitting here in Sofia, where we just launched, with the support of the U.S. government, a media disinformation and digital literacy project. But the main people, as I understand part of it, one of the projects will be our students working with high school students in the region. And so there are always ways to make sure education continues, questioning, some of the things that you've talked about so eloquently, Jonathan.
Let me just cycle back, and that's a great point, Margee. I think, one of the great programs that we worked on globally is debate, high school debate, or university debate, right? And that is so that people could defend different positions. It's really important in authoritarian societies because people don't own what they say, because for the purpose of debate, you're arguing about issues, but it also helps you sort through evidence and argumentation, which is really, really important. It also, in the case of our prison education program, when, the Bard prison debate team beat Harvard in debate, that helped reaffirm that these are worthy people, or whatever you want to say, that the incarcerated students are students who are not just sort of the subjects of charity, or that they are unworthy in an intellectual environment, but that they can, compete in a battle of wits with some of the most, respected people in the United States in terms of the student body. So I totally agree with that, that students, and this is, by being teachers, you are educating yourselves. We want wonderful ESL programs in the local community for undocumented individuals. And those are, really super enriching activities.
So that last question, I'm not sure what is meant by cooperative college models. There's different ways to conceive of that, but perhaps you're clearer on it.
I'm not, I think that's referring to places like Northeastern University, where you're doing internships as a core part of your education, if I'm not mistaken. I don't, other than as a parent looking at it, and it seemed very, I would say, Bard runs a program called Bard NYC, Bard New York City, which is built off of a program we call the Bard Globalization and International Affairs Program, which still exists, which trains, has students do internships during the day and take classes at night. And I think these pre-professional experiences, again, while not only defining the education, but while shaping people's education, allowing them to link theory and practice are very healthy for the educational environment. So my experience with them are very positive. Speaking to alumni who come back, they speak, I just met one the other day, they speak very positively about how that shaped their educational experience, not just because they were pre-professionals, but because it forced them to challenge the theories that they studied in class with the real world. And by being pushed to link theory and practice, I think you enhance people's education.
So let me just make one comment to maybe build on that. One of my dreams for the U.S. is that we would have required national service, required civic engagement, and students growing up in a community couldn't do it there, but they would have to spend a semester or a year working through another university, doing community engagement in a new community. So they learn about places other than the ones that they've grown up in. So I would love to propose and work, if there's anybody on this call who is interested in that. There's lots of groups in the U.S. who've tried to work with this administration in past to set up something like that. Maybe we start with a voluntary national service. But as we look at the issues facing not just those of us in the U.S., those of you in the U.S., but those of us out here, building bridges across difference is critically important for democracies to survive. And I have learned in my experiences that one way to do that is to make sure young people are well trained, but to go out and work with people who are different from us and learn about the problems in a community that's very different for you. So if that's what you meant by cooperative education, I think it was, I can't remember who asked that question, perhaps there's enough people where we could begin to think about how we lobby more. And if it's not national service, as I said earlier, I think universities should band together and try to come up with some of these networks ourselves, not just for studying abroad and working abroad, but civic engagement in other places.
So I think we're pretty much at our end.
Yes.
And I would say, again, I think Maryland just adopted this. It was the first state to adopt it's voluntary, it's not mandatory, but it's really interesting in terms of pushing people out. There's a number of programs which allow people to do that, but I think again it's super enriching. I also think it's important that we link up students around the globe. So one of the things I love is our Open Society University Network collaborative classes, where the class I teach on civic engagement with my colleague KEENAN, we have students from 15 different institutions. We have students from the United States, from Bard College, but also from Myanmar, from Bangladesh, from Kyrgyzstan, from Tajikistan, from all over the world, studying with and learning with and from each other. And that class allows us to partner with other institutions, including the American University of Bulgaria, so that the students in our respective classes can be in dialogue with each other and learn with and from each other when they're discussing these issues. I want to thank Margee. We met for the first time a couple months ago, and it's been an honor to share this and to learn about the amazing work she's done at Dickinson, at American University of Nigeria, and now at she's launching at AUVG. And it's been incredibly enjoyable afternoon. Margee?
Jonathan, so great to be with you. And you, of course, have been doing this important work for decades. So I know the whole university community globally thanks you for your vision and your leadership.
Well, thank you all. Thank Grace, who has now left us, and thank you all for sticking on for this whole session. We really appreciate it. And remember, our next session at Alt Liberal Arts will feature PEN America, where there'll be a 3-lecture series on academic freedom. So those of you interested in that, please go to the website, altliberalarts.org. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
So I'm gonna leave now, and Margee, we will be in touch. Take care. Thank you so much, and I appreciate you finding the space for this.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, John.
Take care. Bye-bye.